Welcome to the Exponentially Me podcast. Have you ever wondered if we can work better, if we get along better, and if leaders can really influence that? In this podcast, these are some of the questions we will be answering. We'll be talking to some amazing people from all around the world, not just thinkers on this, but the doers, giving you practical information that can make you a better colleague and even a better leader. I'm Executive Duval, and like Napoleon, I believe leaders deal in hope. Today, my guest is Mark Durno. Mark is director of AgriFoods at Rockstart. Mark grew up on a farm in Scotland, and like me, being a farm boy taught him a few things. Amongst other things, how the supply chain for food really works. And this is what has become his focus. As director for AgriFoods at Rockstart, he also makes sure that the right investments go to the right startups to build on what we need for the future for food. Today, we talk about the importance of openness and the need to show vulnerability. How much guidance is too much? And how little is really necessary to create a culture that springs up naturally? When we consider people, what is more important, empathy or listening? Mark uses personality profiling to figure out who are going to be those teams that really do the trick. But what are the characteristics he looks for? We also talk about the myth of war and if everything does need to be perfect or not. I hope you enjoy listening to Mark. If we were to say leadership is a relationship, or leadership as a relationship, what does that bring to mind for you?
Well, the first thing that springs to me, or that jumps up for me, is the context of that leadership role, and the fact that I'm quite often working in startup environments, right? So I think you can have different contexts for leadership, whether it be political, sports, maybe it's in a corporate environment, but my context for the most part is in a startup environment. And as a personal relationship, there's no other way for that leadership to be, because you're working under quite a lot of pressure, both practically speaking. You know, you might have a very short cash runway, which is it's almost always the case in in the startup world until you get to being a kind of more of a scale-up phase. So there's the practical pressures. There's the pressures around the fact that not everybody's hired for skill set in that situation. So you're leading teams where maybe they're quite junior people who are doing it out of passion, or it could be first-time entrepreneurs, or it could be somebody who perhaps doesn't have the tech acumen but does have the drive to go forward. So there's always something lacking, and that really comes through, I think, in this kind of leadership relationship. Your personalities and who you are, you create really close bonds. Most of the team members I have, if I think back to Urban Farmers days or Rockstart days, or even the side projects like Edibles and some of these companies that I've been a part of, these are quite deep forged friendships that are built because you do have to lean on one another in more of a capacity than just a professional or a colleague in that leadership sense. So I think the question, you know, how personal is leadership, vary in my context. And you also need to be sympathetic to those people in your team, or in my case as well, beyond that, the portfolio companies I work with, because there's somewhat of a leadership position there when we're coaching or when we're on the board, for example. It's not leadership in the sense of a decision-making role, but it's definitely in terms of coaching and trying to support those entrepreneurs. Also within our broader team within Rockstart, all of those different relationships have got like lots of different pressure points that are coming in that requires you to show a lot of empathy, and ultimately ends in, hopefully in the best cases, in friendships that are quite long-lasting. So, yeah.
Do you also think that where maybe can you tell us a bit more about when leadership as a relationship fails? What happens?
Trying not to jump straight into my first reaction on things, but sometimes that's the best place to go. The word that comes up is trust. When leadership fails, where the relation of leadership fails, there's a breakdown of trust. There's a vulnerability there, and especially you as a leader or someone who, or indeed at times where I'm being led, if there has been a breakdown of understanding or there's been some sort of conflict point, the pain point there is that the trust in that leadership relationship can break down, and that can be very damaging and far-reaching. And you have to remember that in a position of leadership, and this is something I personally sometimes I'm not mindful enough about as well, so I put my hands up there. But in a position of leadership, those people who are leading are showing vulnerability. They're your team, or they're your startup that you're coaching, or they're your mentee, and you're asking them to trust you in your leadership. So if there's a breach in that relationship, I think it can be quite damaging to be an effective team thereafter, and it takes, in my experience, because I have experienced it, it takes quite a long time to rebuild those channels. And of course, like any good relationship, you think about a long-term relationship, a friendship, a marriage, a parent-child relationship, there will be conflict points, and the good ones, you're able to repair those channels and come out the other side stronger. So there is another side to that as well, which is that if you breach that trust part as in a leadership relationship, you've got an opportunity to go in and really dig deeper and say, actually, no, this is really important to me that I rebuild this trust, that I rebuild this leadership relationship with this person, and then you come out the other side a much more resilient relationship, basically. Yeah.
When we look at, you just mentioned that, like any other long-term relationship, trust is important. What else do you think is important? What are the stuff that you would look for off the bat if you look for within startups to see if a team is going to work?
Without a doubt, the first thing is openness. Are you open to coachability? Are you open to criticism? Are you open to other points of view and perspectives, both as a mentee and a leader or a mentor? Both sides need to have that openness, a lack of judgment, an ability to zoom out and look holistically at things. That's something that I think is incredibly important, and it's something we test for when we're making investments in the team dynamics as well, to find out what are these team dynamics, what's the leadership dynamic between the co-founders, between the upper management, etc. Because if you don't have that ability to adapt and understand a different perspective, you're not going to get very far, in our experience.
Do you think that's something we're born with, that we learn, that we can be taught?
For some people, it's just inherent. It's really down. It's that nature nurture thing. How much of who we are do we just arrive with, and we're like, okay, here we are, and this is one of my personality traits, and how much of it is environmental or experiential. So I certainly believe that people are capable of learning that openness and putting systems and practices in place, but some individuals are just more adept at it. They're just through their environment, what they've been exposed to, and who they are as an individual. That's why we do quite extensive personality testing. We do quite extensive kind of interview processes. We try and work with teams to get to know who the individuals are. When we make an investment, we drill down into the personal motivations of the founders, also to help us aid that trust part in the leadership, right? Because if we're going to be a mentor, I should speak from I perspective, if I'm going to be a mentor or a leader with somebody, you need to understand who they are and where they're coming from, what drives them, what vulnerabilities do they have, so that you can be aware of that when you're trying to create joint goals, or when you're trying to steer a conversation together in a certain direction. Some people are just more, they're just better. They just come with that skill. Others, they can definitely learn it. It's just a bit of hard work needs to go into it. So.
I think it's one of the things I run into as well. When somebody starts at a company, you're employing them with a specific perspective in mind, or with a specific view. They don't always fit it, but you only realize maybe some weeks, months, or years later.
Yeah.
And some of the stuff can be trained and some of the stuff can't. However, the person that arrives is the person that you have. You don't know their past. You don't know all the ins and outs of their experiences. And one of the things that I'm currently working a lot with is things that are triggered events or coping mechanisms. So from a psychological perspective, it's somewhere something has happened in your past and you learned a way to deal with it. So you have a trigger and then a coping mechanism. And sometimes those things are not beneficial for the context that you find yourself in now. And you don't see those things in the beginning. There's some of those things you only realize a lot later. Do you guys also work with those kind of things, with triggers, with coping mechanisms, and helping people understand them?
A soft yes is the answer to that. I say soft because I'm no expert at that. I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not going to pretend to go into a meeting and understand the depths of a person through a series of conversations. But you can get a good understanding, and especially having worked with hundreds of founders and also in multiple teams with, like I said, different pressure points, you get to see some common traits that are in place. But every individual is, of course, unique in that sense. And within our team, within our internal team now, so looking less about my leadership position towards startups and externals, but looking more internally at our leadership team, we have effectively deployed coaching, we have effectively deployed mentorship, we have effectively deployed therapy sessions as well, speaking personally, which have allowed me in times of growth, and by growth that's a nice way of saying I was really stressed out and didn't know what to do. I was able to talk those things through and get a different perspective on it. So it comes again back to that openness, that coachability for a leadership and mentee relationship. And I'll speak personally, right? So rather than pointing at others as examples, but one of my trigger mechanisms is, and Eckstein, when we were talking earlier, you made reference to the point that I usually get on quite well with people. There's not a lot of people that, I don't think there's a lot of people that inherently dislike me or working with me. However, a lot of that comes from my trigger point that I'm naturally conflict averse. I don't want to enter into a conflict situation, and at times that's damaging. Sometimes you just need to talk it out, and you need to have some hard words that are said, and you need to clear the air and put it on the table. And as a result of my being conflict averse, I can sometimes end up feeling backed into a corner, which on a few occasions, means I erupt out of this awful passive aggressive situation into pure aggression. So through coaching and also through some therapy sessions with those coaches as well that we organize professionally through work, we're able to kind of unpeel those aspects and figure out where they come from. And as soon as you become aware of it, you're empowered. So now I can kind of feel these tensions. When these tensions come up, I'm like, oh, there's going to be a trigger point quite soon. So I can kind of vocalize that to my team members and say, listen, you know what I'm like. I don't really want to have an argument, but it feels like it's heading that direction. So let's just take a breather, call things out a little bit placidly, and reflect on it until tomorrow, next week, whatever. So I do believe that that's very, very helpful, especially when you're in these pressure environments that I'm describing, where it's this mix between being a professional environment but also very personal, because it's startup, so it's really inherently linked to the individuals who are working on the project. Yeah,
I think it's the difference is, for me, is, are you the mum or dad, or are you the nanny? For me, a CEO 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, is the nanny. The founder is the mum or dad. The emotional connection to your baby is much stronger.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine that those emotions can ride high sometimes.
Yeah, especially when you're thinking about people, right? You'll know, Eckstein, you have these three positions you take in discussion. You're either going to be an adult to adult, which is two people talking as adults rationally to one another, or you can slip into the extremes of personality, which is either a parent, so it means you're either trying to direct or protect, or a child, which just means that you're either trying to defend or rebel. And because of that emotional context that you just described, which is that founders feel like they are the parent of their startup, you're flicking between these kind of positions in the conversation. So being aware of that is quite important in the leadership role, and trying to not allow yourself to fall into one of those groups. that's something I've struggled with in the past, but got better at through practice.
I think it reminds me of something that I spoke to Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen about. I did this training with them on negotiation and mediation at Harvard Law, and they in Difficult Conversations, the book they wrote, they talk about something called "There's no way of sugarcoating a hand grenade."
Mm.
Sometimes you need to bring bad news, and it's going to hurt.
Yeah.
Okay, and no amount of sugarcoating or pussyfooting about it, walking around, nothing's going to help. You just need to get it out. And I think that from a leadership perspective, sometimes that desire not to hurt people interferes with getting through the hand grenade moment, because there's going to be blood, sweat, and tears. It's going to hurt. But you need to make that as sharp, as soon, and quick as possible, and don't hang in it. Yeah. One of the things I do is when somebody needs to be fired, I just say, you know what, this situation, this is what's going to happen. The process as follows. You're going to leave for home now, and we'll have a conversation about this next week. Just so that the person has the opportunity to go and reframe how they want to talk, because in the moment it's just too much. They're going to say stuff that they're going to regret, and you might respond with stuff that you're going to regret.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also a power thing, right? If you come into the conversation knowing where you want to take it, you're in design of where that conversation can go. The other person can feel pretty helpless.
Yes.
So I think that's very respectful. Give them the hard truth straight up front. Give them time to reflect on it. I'm a terrible one for delivering a shit sandwich. It's like, here's a nice piece of bread, here's some shit to put in the middle of it, and here's another nice piece of bread. That's what I've done in the past. Of course, I tend to be much more directive about, or try to be much more directive about messages now. But that was a learning curve as well, because of that power play that you have as a leader, right? You're in the position of power many times, so you need to be respectful of the other person that's in the room and in the conversation. Definitely.
I think which is that if you, as a leader, you say something to a subordinate, it's like the message hits 10 times harder.
Yeah. Not just saying something, behaving. Like I just said the S word, I said shit in a podcast, which is normal at Rockstar. Sorry if I'm not supposed to swear. But that cultural part, like turning up to a meeting in shorts versus trousers could be a discussion point, right? That message reverberates, and you can see that. So there is a responsibility. I think a responsibility, but at least an awareness you have to have as a leader that it's not just what you say, it's how you're behaving, it's how you're acting, it's what you're wearing, it's everything. You're directing culture.
Yeah, I think that's also the one. On the one hand, the other hand, this is also important to be. I hate the word authentic because it's sort of been used to death a lot. But just be yourself.
Yeah.
So if you don't usually go to, for me, my guys, unless we go into a client or we talk to a client, if you normally get up in the morning, you put on a T-shirt, it's okay. I'm not going to berate you for wearing a T-shirt. I mean, there's more important things in life than that. And as long as you wear underwear and you're sitting down and you've got a shirt on and I only have to look at the top, it's fine,
just nipples up. It needs to be professional.
Just don't. When you get up, I don't want to be exposed to everything in the world. If there's some sort of covering, it's fine. Just And I think the world's changing when that's concerned. Even as little as 2-3 years ago, the amount of tolerance there was required within companies was much less. And on the one hand, the other hand is that the compassion levels have seemingly gone up. The irritation levels as well, but that's because of stress,
Yeah.
And compassionless. I'm going to talk to you about that in a second, but just something else. Hannes, this is a professor at RSM. They recently did a meta-study where they looked at leadership training. And they actually said that strength training has been shown to have either no effect or a negative correlation with leadership growth. Because growth, as you were saying earlier, needs an element of pain. It needs an element of self-reflection where you go like, ooh, and that's what gives us our growth. And it was just interesting that you mentioned that as well.
Yeah, we're quite a basic species. We need to bang our head into the wall to figure out that hurts. And watch somebody else do it and be like, that looked like it hurt, but maybe if I try it, I've got a thicker skull or something. And then you bang your head and you think, yeah, it definitely hurts. I won't do that again. So
I can
that's why I say
imagine.
that it's experiential, environmental is
Yeah.
the thing that informs leadership as well. Yeah.
So I can imagine that you've seen the startup hit their heads against the same wall.
Oh gosh, yeah.
What kind of walls are we talking about?
Every wall they can find. Any wall. And sometimes that's really painful. I got a piece of advice from a colleague of mine, Frederick Bishop, who was my counterpart in the energy transition. Basically, he works with energy startups, and he was working with in this capacity with startups before I was, so he was mentoring me a bit. And I said, look, what's the hardest thing? He said, the hardest thing is sitting on your hands and allowing the entrepreneur or allowing the mentee to go and figure out the pain point themselves. But if you don't do that, if you guide them, if you protect them, and you don't let those individuals to actually find their own pain and hence growth, you're not going to create resilient and robust entrepreneurs. And it was a great piece of advice, because now, having done this for a while and worked with multiple founders and companies, it's quite often the same wall that we're looking at, and you can say your piece, and then you have to step back and let them reflect on it, and either go out and triangulate. The good ones go out and triangulate that and say, oh, I might be able to avoid hitting my head on this particular wall. Yeah, but it can be multiple different things, Extine. It can be anything from funding strategies to decisions around what to prioritize on product versus commercial. It can be team decisions and hiring, where you hire for skill above culture. That has an impact, of course. Yeah, you name it. They want to headbutt it and find out.
Mm.
Yeah.
Do you see a lot of people making that differentiation, skill above culture?
It's definitely a talking point when we were talking about hiring and the importance of skill versus culture. And in my context, I can't speak so much about larger corporations and or government or NGO or anything like that. But in my context of the startup world, you have finite resources. So you really need, as a decision maker, you have to decide based on, well, what's the bang for the buck here? Not just in terms of ROI, like from a value creation perspective, but what's going to get us through the next hurdle and allow us to stay on this mission. And sometimes you might have to hire skill above culture because you just need to get something done and it's urgent, it's on the roadmap. Having done that and experienced that firsthand, I can say it can be damaging because then you've got a cultural fallout. So I can't stress enough how important it is to, at the early stages, take HR strategy advice, and at the mid stages, as soon as you can afford to bring somebody in who starts kind of working with you as a leader on HR strategy and who to hire when and what profiles we're looking for, and design the system to do it, the better. Because you also get less churn in staff because the team's happier, because they fit and it feels good. And yeah, so.
Since we already introduced the word shit, let me introduce another one.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. When I also want to get the point across, I sometimes tell people a competent asshole is predominantly an asshole.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, nobody can work with a person. Over time, the destruction that's caused in your culture, in your ability to be vulnerable, in the ability for people to take ownership of stuff and be authentic, it's just so damaging that to regain that can take 6 months to 2 years before you have that back, and it takes one wrong person to do that.
Yeah.
And so, I totally agree.
100% agree, and that's why coachability comes into it, right? If you can meet people and bring them into your team who are open and coachable, they've got a low asshole gauge, I guess you could call it. Right? They're able to empathize and understand the team. Yeah.
I think it's something interesting. You keep on using the word empathy, and I would zoom in a little bit on that. There's also an asshole tends to be some people that almost have psychopathic or sociopathic tendencies in some organizations. So when we look at corporate culture, or corporate environments, we normally, or in general humans, we look at a triangle, which at the top is the ability to see that people are feeling an emotion. It's also known as cognitive empathy. On the other hand, we have, let's go this way. On this side, we have affective empathy. It's the ability to see, not see, but to feel something about it. So otherwise known as give a damn. All right. And the other one over here is compassionate empathy, which is the willingness to do something about it. So it's the see, feel, do triangle. And people that have, for instance, are on the Asperger spectrum or on anything associated with that tend to have a difficult time to see. And then people in the sociopathic, psychopathic corner, they tend to not really give a damn. And then the people, and then in organizations in general and corporates, the willingness to do seems to be suppressed. So people go like, yeah, don't be so emotional, don't get involved, all those kind of statements that you hear. Now in startup world, I think those don't get involved would be detrimental to everybody if you don't get involved, because the whole organization could fall apart. And so if you look at that, if you say, well, this ability, for instance, to see, do you see that some people are better at gauging a situation or feeling the situation? And does that help?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. Some people are inherently better, and it goes back to what I said before. It's just a skill that you this nature nurture. You can develop it, but even though you're good, I mean, at Rockstart, what we test for and what we look for in our investments is we test for EQ. So we want that emotional element to be within the team, because just as you described it, it's essential for leadership and being able to take a project forwards. What I've experienced is that you can have people, and I'm going to use myself as an example again, because I don't like to point at others, but I consider myself to have a fairly inherent or like a natural, I'm empathetic. I can empathize pretty well, and I can, especially if I'm meeting with a person in person as opposed to over Zoom, I can kind of read them quite well about how they're feeling, and I like to check in at the start of meetings to say how you're doing and so forth. I've also experienced it where I've reached like an empathy capacity, where I've gone that I'm having to care so much about all the shit that's going on around me that I don't know what the hell to do about this anymore, and I'm giving less of a damn. I need to be like way more direct, and I'm sorry, I have to give less of a damn about what the hell's going on here, because we just need to get through this crisis moment. That can be difficult, right? Because even though you're an empathetic person and you know that skill and your team knows you for it, suddenly there's this other version of yourself that needs to come in to execute things as a leader. You can't always be perfectly balanced within that triangle, because if you are perfectly balanced within the triangle, sometimes if you've got 8 weeks of runway ahead of you and your company's going to fold in 8 weeks, and that means everyone's going to lose their jobs in 2 months' time, then sometimes you have to just put down the empathy bag and go like, EQ can wait just now. We've got some practical stuff to execute upon. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of went off on a tangent there a little bit, Extine, but I would say yes, some people are better than others, and usually those leaders are the most effective because they listen to their team. They listen to what's needed. And by doing that, you also listen to the organization. You get to hear the little beeps and dials and the heartbeat of what's going on across different teams much more effectively. So you can say, okay, that corner of the organization is not feeling too hot. We should really look into why that is and figure out if there's not something within the company that we're doing that's actually making people feel a little bit down or like they're underperforming in some way. So it's very important, yeah.
Do you also know that, did you know that ability is genetic?
No, I did not know that. Oh.
Ability to see people's emotions, what they're feeling, has a genetic component.
Okay.
There's a test called, it's called the cognitive empathy test, or the mind in the eyes, as they call it. It's, Sacha Baron Cohen, the comedian?
Yeah.
His cousin works at Oxford, and he came up with this test 30, 40 years ago. And they combined that test with 23andMe, the genetics company, and they found the genes involved. And so, but their main goal was to look for autism or for Asperger's genes that were involved in that. So how does that hamper your ability to stuff? But they seem to have forgotten that there is a bell curve in most statistics. And so when they started looking at the numbers, they realized there were also people that were exceptional at this. And then they started looking at the genes on that side. And so they figured out that if certain genes are present, I like to call it a super seer is born. somebody that has this ability where they can articulate your emotions even before you know it.
Wow.
I also call it the Donna effect. Did you ever see this TV series Suits?
I know it, but I'm afraid I have not watched it.
There's an assistant or a secretary in there called Donna.
Yeah.
And Donna's claim to fame is she knows what you want before you do. And these people can actually do that. And I sort of took it with a pinch of salt till I employed Elena. She's the clinical psychologist we're working with. And Elena has that. Elena tests it off the charts on this. I mean, it's like amazing. So when I put her in a room, she just tells me, okay, when you said that, that person was upset about it. This person liked it. You know, she can just sees it. It's like an open book to her. You know, I'm like, seriously, all right. The other thing that I come to realize is the moment that, or not realize, there's some studies were done, is that the moment you talk, your ability to observe is switched off. Mm-hmm. It's not that it becomes less; it is switched off. All right. So leaders that talk a lot don't hear a lot, not because they're talking, but they can't observe. They can't even read faces. You know, all this stuff just sort of switches off. The emotive side switches off. You don't observe that. So these days I tell people, make sure that you have at least one Donna in your company. Somebody that's going to come tell you, you're being an ass.
Yeah.
And people are picking up on that, you know.
Absolutely. I've also been in teams where we've said, right, the CEO actually is never leading a meeting because they need to observe. Just what you said, if you're sending the whole time, of course there are times when the CEO in the leadership position has to stand up and direct the vision or the milestones of the company, whatever, inspire. But quite often the actual conversation, it's better to be in an observing role and be able to read the dynamic between the team or the individuals. But I didn't know that about it being genetic. Now I'm almost tempted to go and get a little blood test done and figure out where I am on that spectrum. But
what you can also do is if you do the mind in the eyes test, if you score above about, I think it's 34 out of 36, then there's a high probability of you having that gene. There's two sides to it. The one is the ability to see, right, and then the ability to feel and do and so on. But the other side of it is what motivates me, what drives me. And as we go through life, we build these structures, and the brain structures are built as we go along. It's not like we have a saying that go like, don't build that bit, you know. But when we start hitting sort of like late 20s, that is mainly formed. Also the way that we look at relationships. So we see that motivation is also tied in with that. So when, let's say 25 with a year or two sort of, let's call it standard deviation on there. But from that point on, we tweak. We don't form stuff anymore. It's sort of, I don't know if you ever heard of neural pruning.
Yeah, but I'm not going to pretend I know about it.
Let's make it really simple. Yeah. Because I mean, we have people that's going to be listening and they can't see my hand. So I have to also, let me explain this. So imagine two paths running next to each other. Mm-hmm. When we want to strengthen them, we build little side tracks between them. And when we go like, yeah, they're actually not related, we get rid of the paths in between. Mm-hmm. So eventually when we're really young, so when with babies, you get all these pathways, like a forest full of pathways. And then as you get older, especially in your teenage years, this pruning starts. And you start getting rid of stuff that you're not using. So now you start thinking faster, up to 3,000 times faster. But you're thinking in patterns, predetermined patterns, because you got rid of the ones in between. And so now you've got highways instead of paths, but if something happens on that highway, it can be quite detrimental. Yeah. So running at 3,000 times the speed into an obstacle is a little bit more difficult than taking a small little path around it. And so traumatic events and things like that can really impact our ability to think and concentrate about things. But anyway, that's a sort of the basic principle. There's also things within our brains that help us build those pathways. So, for instance, there's something called misophonia. Misophonia is where you get angry when somebody opens a crisp packet or chews with their mouth open. Your anger center in your brain has more pathways between the anger and specific frequencies that you might hear, or the auditive side of your brain. So you end up with going from being happy-go-lucky to not just mild annoyance, but full-on anger without understanding why. And then you go like, yeah, but people chew too loudly, or people this, or people that. But it's actually just a set of frequencies that trigger this for you. The moment you know this, you just go like, okay.
That's happening.
And so like you were saying earlier about coaching, that awareness, just being aware that something is there, can already start modifying what we do.
Yeah.
And so I was talking about how we develop, and one of the things in that is motivational drivers. So when we look at things we enjoy doing, it's not a task, it's usually a group of activities or a specific perspective. So for instance, for me, the thing that motivates and drives me the most is creativity. That doesn't mean I'm going to sit there with a sketch pad and draw a tree. Yeah. It means I can look at a process and try and find a different approach to it. And specifically stuff that hasn't been solved before. That's the kind of stuff that I really like sinking my teeth into. So if you think within the environment of startups, do you think there are certain motivators or drivers or things that is inherent in people that you look for or that you see makes people more successful?
Good question. Gosh. It's such a broad array. So if I try and narrow it down, what we're looking for is this internal drive or passion for the thing that the individual is working on. Oftentimes there's one thing that's on a slide deck. They're saying the mission is this. And if you get talking to the founders, it's actually something completely different. It's normally linked to some collision course that you described before, that you've been on that superhighway and then you've hit some trauma and then you've gone, I need to solve this. And actually it spills over into the activities that you do in life and how you approach things. So yeah, we do test for it. We don't ask up front every founder, we need to know what it is your driving motivation underlying all this stuff, because actually to get down to that, you require some trust, and you need to go through some hours of working together to get to that conversation. So we don't block an investment before, it's not like we need to hear that and be convinced of it before we invest. But when we're working with a startup, what we will look for and what we get good at, because we're working with so many early stage founders, is recognizing those individuals who have got some tenacity. You need to have resilience in place. You need to be dogged about the mission that you're on. You need to have creativity is very important, because how are you going to solve the problems that come up every single day? Because they will. You're building the thing as it's operating. So we try and look for it as best that we can through wisdom of the crowd. We usually have founders meeting with multiple mentors and investors in our network first and getting feedback about how they experience that. We do these personality profiling. We work with a company that we've been working with, the same consultancy company who specialize in HR since 2010, to try and test for these things and see where there are patterns. And then eventually you get to the point where there's an investment made, and then there's enough trust in place that we can go, yeah, but what really drives you? What's the thing that's really pushing you forwards? And when we've made a great choice, it's usually there's some really core motivation that links back to their childhood or to some experience or injustice. Quite often that comes up, that there's a fight for some sort of new way of doing things that is going to solve an injustice they've experienced. That's when it gets quite exciting, because you think, okay, this person's mission is really built into them as an individual. They're going to carry this forwards no matter how hard the obstacle. And then you've also got the bones, at least, of a really strong leader, because that kind of passion and that kind of motivation it rallies the troops, and people can get behind it. So and of course then you have to start training for the type of leadership. At different stages of the startup's journey, it requires a different type of leader, and not all of those people who have got tenacity, resilience, passion, driving personal motivation are the right people to scale a company from 30 to 300. Then you need a different type of leadership personality. But maybe now I'm jumping ahead of myself. So
within the executive functions, you've got planning and prioritization. Planning is the sequence of events, and prioritization is making selections to be able to determine what needs to happen first and what needs to happen second. So part of that planning is also the ability to oversee what needs to be done in sequence and that are related to each other. Yeah. When it comes to organization, it has to do with people and planning. So how many different things needs to be organized together to get to a desired outcome. And if I remember correctly, what you were saying is that people struggle to see beyond the immediate, but that also means long-term planning
Mm.
seems to then suffer.
Yeah, in certain circumstances. So of course everything's really subjective there. So, but in a startup environment where you're under duress on multiple different factors all at once, there can be a tendency to focus on what's urgent and important only. In as the leader, as the person who's in charge of making the decisions, and especially where, as we spoke about before, you might be suffering from some extreme stress, right? So if your cortisone levels are up and you're struggling to make strategic choices and everything seems to be coming at you all at the same time, it can be tempting to choose to work on what feels most urgent and most important. And the important thing the point I was trying to put across there was that within the startup environment, at least, it's really important to be able to zoom out and look holistically. It sounds very obvious. It sounds really obvious when you say it just now in a calm setting, but when you're firefighting day to day to make sure that you can keep this thing afloat and make sure you sign the first pilots and make sure you get that first investor on board, then it's a very different set of circumstances. You're in the fight, and when people are swinging at you, you kind of you're either defending or attacking, and not really taking a moment to sit back and think about strategy again. So it's a very obvious statement that I'm making, but it's one that quite often founders find themselves in a tough spot, because in an individual, you've got all of this stress landing on you as the founder or as the CEO of a kind of high tempo, high octane project that you're trying to lead and usher in a good way. So.
I think I think one thing is, there's two things that I find important there. One is that it has to do with so organization has to do with keeping track of physical and mentally of and physically of things that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
And when you feel overwhelmed, that becomes difficult. So I can imagine that when you're in a really tough spot and really under stress as a startup founder, that it can feel sometimes overwhelming. I was just wondering, what do you guys do about that? I mean, how do you get a founder out of that tough spot?
I got a good. I went to one of my mentors a couple of years ago, who's an experienced VC in this space, and he had this to say to me, because I said, look, it's overwhelming. I've got so much stuff coming over my desk, and of course I want to be able to set a good example to the founders that I'm working with. His advice to me was, you have to get rid of the myth of or. There's no longer, the word or no longer exists for you. You don't get to do this or that. You have to do this and that. And you need to learn that you have to do this and that, 2 things or 3 things or 4 things multitasked to the best of what's required. Not everything has to be perfect. The 80-20 rule needs to be applied voraciously. And you need to take fast and informed decisions, and then live with those decisions, because the outcome of the decision is, of course, the reality that you then have. So don't rue on past decisions that maybe went in the wrong direction. You need to keep on looking forwards and trying to zoom out as often as you can to make sure that you can course correct later. But the idea that you can, like as a founder, the idea that your life is going to be more peaceful in a startup environment is not true. If you want to have quiet, easy life, or not easy life, but if you would like to have a structured week where you're not getting called up on Friday evening with something that needs to be solved, do not start a company, because that's really the reality of it. Is that it goes back to the very first point that we were making in this discussion, which is that the professional and the personal just get merged, they get intertwined, because this is something that you're passionate about, and you as an individual, you have to lift far more than the average person. And just to clarify, I don't want to make it sound grand that there's some sort of kind of martyrdom or like a heroic thing about it. It's not. You're really silly. Your health's going to be a lot better if you find a job that gives you structure and protection. But generally speaking, these are the kind of conversations that we'll have. Yeah.
I think it's something I want to highlight there is that you're talking about this ability to make decisions and then move on. There's a book called The CEO Next Door, which talks about 4 different characteristics of great CEOs. And one of those is make decisions and move on. And the other thing is that I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's basically learn to dance in uncertainty. Because you will have to have light touch and move forward instead of getting completely absorbed and be the subject matter expert. You very quickly step off that when you're in a leadership position.
Yeah.
And then the support structures around you. One of the things that gets cortisol under control or helps to influence it is something called oxytocin. And oxytocin is our relationship drug or a relationship hormone. And one of the ways of getting that is just getting it from a hug. So when I found that out, I just went to my better half and said, you know what? When I get up in the morning, I don't care what you do, but the first thing I want is a hug. And strangely enough, during COVID, that seems to have helped, Hasn't solved the problem, but it seems to have helped. And so those relationship bonds that we have, there are different ways of triggering it. One of the ways we trigger it is with small acts of human kindness, but non-reciprocal acts of human kindness. So the simplest form of that is, up in your neck of the woods, get somebody a cup of coffee, or even better, get them a cup of tea, right?
Tea,
or a glass of a nip of something,
Something a wee bit stronger.
Yeah, a wee bit stronger. It's one of those things where you just give somebody something, and it's really weird if they gave it back to you. So it's non-transactional. So a cup of tea, or a glass of whiskey, or a glass of water. It doesn't really matter. It's just that act of giving. And the person receiving it gets a bit of that oxytocin, but also the person giving and the person observing, which is something we tend to forget. So when teams see that they're doing nice things for each other, it triggers more nice things being done, which means the oxytocin release gets into sort of an exponential growth. And that really brings people closer together. And it's a simple thing, but we see in teams that are really under duress and stress in corporate environments that works.
Well, it's an interesting one now in current times when our organization is remote first. So everybody, like I'm currently in Scotland, and many of my team members are spread across Denmark, the Netherlands, Portugal, France, Spain, Russia. We've got portfolio companies who I've never even met in person, who we're working with here. So what you're saying is quite interesting, because indeed, usually in the office, you would be able to turn around to a colleague and say, I'm going to get a cup of coffee, would you like one? Or do some small act of kindness. Now we've had to be a little bit more thoughtful and strategic about how we do that. So that means, for example, sending out goodie bags to all of the team members. We had like an online kind of tasting course. We had another little session where a goodie bag was sent out for one of the alignment meetings, just so that we could all sit and share a packet of crisps together. And we were still talking about the same stuff. It was still a strategy meeting about the business, but of course it takes far more coordination to try and stay connected. And I do find, I think it depends on the personality, of course. Some people really enjoy the remote first environment because they can determine their own time very well. Others feel disconnected. I'm somewhere in the middle. I kind of miss, when I notice my energy levels jump up dramatically when I get to engage in person with the team and sit down and have a conversation and read them properly, as opposed to having a transaction online. Because it's quite often, you have in leadership as well, it's really difficult not to just turn it into a transactional conversation, because you're just optimizing for time efficiency, and to actually make time to understand how people are doing, where they're at. It's difficult. It's a difficult balance.
I think what works to the benefit of leaders, however, is one we talked about earlier in the conversation about the amplifying effect of leadership. So the moment you're sitting in a role where you have a leadership role, the impact of what you do has wider repercussions and stronger repercussions. One of the bits of research was done about fairness in companies was that time is the great equalizer. So it is not about doing something for one person, something else for another. That's usually not where the fairness is perceived. And from an HR perspective, we tend to have been bombarded with do everything the same for everyone because that is fair. But the real fairness is perceived in time. So how much time does a leader spend with someone? And if you spend more time with people that are underperforming, you're in essence rewarding bad behavior. So what you also see now with COVID is that the time you take out of your day just to call someone and check in and see how they're doing, that becomes the new act of kindness.
Yeah.
And when people start talking about that and said, oh, it was really nice this morning to have that call for 15 minutes just to check in, and they mention that in a meeting, all of a sudden you get that group effect as well,
Yeah.
especially if everybody gets it. But you can't call one person and not another.
No. Yeah, and I think it also needs to be a spontaneous act. It can we tried it in the organization where we were scheduling coffee check-ins. So you had this app on Slack. I don't know if you've come across it, called Donut. So you have these donut meetings, and it just randomly pairs people up. It didn't. Some people really liked it because you got randomly paired with somebody, so you would have a chance to have a cup of coffee and a check-in. But for the most part, it felt a little bit insincere, because
Yes.
you were kind of forcing this social aspect to your day, as opposed and having a framework pushed down on top of you, as opposed to having a colleague reach out and say, "How are you, Mark?" or "How are you, Extine?" You know,
No,
how you coping with stuff. So I think it's also the framing and the way it's brought is really important. It needs to be brought in a human way and not in like,
correct.
okay, this is going to be good for our office vibe scoring.
Yeah. Everything that's done from the company
Yeah.
does not have the personal feel.
Yeah.
The thing, one of the things we're working on now as well is one of the tips has to do with what we actually learned from hostage negotiations. When you establish rapport with a hostage taker, you need to do that with very limited communications means. So it's usually just a telephone line. So one of the tricks that Chris Voss talks about is, I was lucky enough to be in class with him at when I did this one course at Harvard, and it was just amazing to see him in action. He's really good where that's concerned. But anyway, he was the lead hostage negotiator for the FBI, and one of the things he writes about in his book, Never Split the Difference, is about how to establish that rapport. And there's two elements to it. The one is only ask how and what questions, open-ended, of course. And then when you paraphrase or summarize what the person says, there's content and there's emotion. And always label the emotion. So that sounds, whatever the situation is, that sounds really frustrating, or sounds like you're struggling with this. The moment you start doing that and you ask the what and how questions, it establishes rapport. And his check for it is, if the person says, that's right, then you know you've established rapport. If they say, you're right, it's a case of, yeah, you're right, bye. And trying to get rid of you. And so this is a little trick we're now sort of trying to teach leaders is say, make the phone call. So you can easily do that. You send them a WhatsApp and say, listen, do you have 5 minutes? And just say, ask the what and the how questions and summarize and go like, that sounds frustrating, or it sounds like you're having a great day, or just label the emotion, because the moment we add that, it becomes, instead of facts, it becomes a personal conversation.
Yeah, that's a strong insight, definitely. Yeah.
So that's something I think that people can also use and try out. We were talking about the stress and the duress and stuff like that. What I was also wanted to say is, how does personal relationships get affected by startups?
I definitely see that when there's two entrepreneurs. I'm generalizing a little bit here, but when there are two entrepreneurs, and I was talking to an entrepreneur friend of mine the other week, and we were speaking about significant others when you're an entrepreneur, and the fact is that you're so committed to the project, and your time constraints there, and the stress and also the achievement and the celebration that comes alongside it is such a roller coaster ride that it makes it very difficult for a significant other to sometimes to fit into that schedule, right? It can be hard. You have to prioritize them, which I have not always been the best at doing. And we were talking about the fact that we observed that the successful relationships in our culture, in the startup culture, usually consisted of two entrepreneurs. So when you got the phone call saying, "Look, I can't come in tonight because something's happened at work, or I need to go to this conference, or I've got a sudden last minute investor call, or whatever," the other significant other who's also an entrepreneur would be very understanding of it, because it's almost like, okay, got it, I understand the reason and the drive, and also this is a little credit point for me because I'm pretty much going to do this to you at some point. So you have like this kind of new, another way to think of it is that you've got a bank account with one another, and if you keep on withdrawing, you don't put anything in, you end up in the overdraft, and that
Mm.
becomes dangerous in the relationship. And I think where you've got two entrepreneurs, or it doesn't have to be two entrepreneurs, it can be two people who have got a really targeted focus on a specific subject. One person could be a researcher that's really into their postdoc, and another person could be starting a company or an NGO or something. Where you've got that balance, I observe that it works better. Um, Again, I don't really want to generalize because it's so subjective to the individual, and
Mm.
I'm not an expert on this. I can only talk from my own perspective, which is that my relationships across the board have suffered because of
Mm.
um, my own. Yeah, I'm really resilient. I'll prioritize the project or the mission that I'm on above many things. So that means friendships, means love relationships, means all sorts of things, family members.
Mm.
And luckily for me, many of those people are very understanding.
Mm.
Um, yeah, but it's definitely difficult. Yeah.
And from my hubby and I, it's been the same in that he has a very demanding job. And he works now, especially now, he works from, sometimes the meetings start at 6 o'clock in the morning, and 7, 8 o'clock at night he's still busy because there's China all the way through to the US that he deals with. And so we've sort of found that it's handy to reserve time.
Hmm.
So, well, okay, that is dedicated us time, and we just go for a walk.
Yeah.
And the thing is, now with COVID, we're in lockdown, and you can sort of block your time around lunch. It's just been nice to block the time and just go for a walk during lunchtime. And the rest of the day is everybody else's, but have half an hour just for each other. I think that's one thing that's helped us. The other thing is financial stress.
Hmm.
So when one person creates stability and has a full-time job that pays for everything, and the other person's income does this, it makes life a little bit easier in that you don't have to worry about am I gonna be able to pay the mortgage in the month, kind of thing. And I
Hmm.
think that creates for I mean, I'm slightly older, so it's I'm also not 20 willing to live in a flat above a pizzeria kind of thing. You know, that's I think I'm wondering, do you also see that older entrepreneurs have a different approach than people in their 20s?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's why the majority of successful startups come from people in their 40s.
Mm.
It's because it comes down to experience. You have a much more rounded understanding of the world. You've banged your head against that wall that we spoke about earlier and learned a few lessons. You've probably met people and surrounded by yourself by people who are there for the long haul. So that means that you don't have this like wide berth of friendship pool that you're trying to coordinate. And instead, you've got maybe two or three core friends, or I can generalize about a few of these points, but what we tend to see is that more mature entrepreneurs are just more senior entrepreneurs are just a bit more mature in their outlook because they've had the benefit of experience. Saying that, of course, you get really talented people in their 20s who are driven and have energy and are taking measured risks that you might not want to take if you've got other obligations later in life. So it doesn't necessarily mean that those younger entrepreneurs are worse or are somehow less good at dealing with stress or balancing things. Um, I can think of at least a few examples of entrepreneurs that we've invested in their mid 20s who are doing a far better job, comparatively speaking, in balancing that than I would have been at their age. So um, there's not a silver bullet, but you with age comes experience, and
Mm.
that allows you to take it, and also it comes perspective. As I've grown older as an entrepreneur, I know, for example, that this probably won't be my one silver bullet last venture. when I first started off in entrepreneurship, which was by accident, 12 odd years ago, I had that unrealistic, idealistic expectation that this is so needed by the world that it's going to scale and become huge and it's going to be my life's work and I'm going to have this wonderful legacy to come from it. No, most times that's not true. Most times you can definitely move the needle on things, but you need to give yourself a break and know that it's okay that if that something perhaps doesn't reach the potential that you first hoped for, or indeed that it may be a stepping stone towards something bigger down the line. So you can be a little bit more, because you've stretched over a longer period of time, then you understand how time works a bit better. And I think that goes to your favor as an entrepreneur sometimes. I always like to counter that, of course, because the wonderful thing about being an entrepreneur in your 20s, in your early 20s, and being just like high on energy and the kind of the fuel of all of that passion and excitement about building something, is you can get shit done really fast because you're not constrained. And you're not thinking, well, as I am just now, I've got two young kids. So I want to make sure that I safeguard time for them in the week. Now, I would never give up that time for the job that I have because it's so precious. And I don't resent spending time with them at all. But if you're in your 20s and you don't have that obligation, then you're going to win an extra 20 hours in the week or whatever it may be from Monday to Friday that you spend. So, yeah, the question, are we better placed as an older entrepreneur to deal with stress? Maybe, but there are certainly some advantages to being to being in your 20s without those constraints and also without the learnings to scare you. That's a point I really want to actually focus in on for a second, is that sometimes experience tells you all the reasons why you shouldn't do something. Many people, if they knew what they knew now, and like you ask most entrepreneurs that have gone out and built companies and say to them, if you knew what you know now, would you have gone and done that at that time? You go, no way. Like that's been such a hard route. We had no idea about the regulations to be so hard, so difficult, or we didn't realize that there were going to be so many competitors in this market, or we didn't realize that the tech was going to take 3 years longer to scale, and I was going to have to be on a 30% salary than what I would normally. There's loads of things that you can only do it if you don't know. So the ignorance is bliss sometimes. But anyway, I'll pause for thought, Extine, because I'm kind of going on a tangent with this now.
No, I think it's a very interesting perspective. It's that I think it sort of symbolizes Europe and the US for me. Most of the time that I spent in the US, it was a case of, yes, we can, and just run with things, sometimes without even thinking, and just get it done. Yeah. The drawback with all that is the amount of times you bump your head, and but that absolute pure joy of just going is enticing. Yeah. And when I tried to bring some of that back to the Netherlands, I very quickly realized there's also no, we can't culture, and you sort of all the risks being listed first. You're like, yeah, but we'll deal with them later. We don't have to deal with them right now, sort of thing. And so I get that. What I think is also interesting is then to think, but what kind of startup teams work well then? Is it ones where you have only young people or only older people, or a group, sort of like a differentiation in age?
Well, first, just to double down on your point about geographical cultural differences, definitely in Europe we're not set up for failure. We're setting up for success, which means that we try and de-risk things, which slows us down. Whereas our cousins in North America, but also the experience I have with Indian companies, for example, are far more welcoming of failure, which is only positive because it allows us to go faster and iterate things. But that's a separate topic. What makes a good startup team? Well, you need to have that tenacity. You need to have a somewhat some naivety about what it takes to scale the project is good, because it doesn't scare you off the sheer scale and the magnitude of what you're trying to do. Usually we find there needs to be a very strong balance between commercial and technical acumen. So the best teams have got a real eye for the market and timing, and they understand the timing of a market. So that's the commercial part, having really that edge where you can almost predict or you have a feeling of what's about to come in that market, so you know how to position your product or service, alongside a very strong technical co-founder who's got a vision on the product or the service. Because you can have commercial vision about what you want to do, but if you don't have a counterpart that's able to actually manifest that vision into something tangible, and the steps that you need to take to get there, then it's a very rocky road. And we find loads of companies, loads of startups that have got one but not the other. And we spend a long time testing teams to find out how that balance looks and what the dynamic is between the team. It's really those factors, and also the dynamic part and how the team works together. So coming to your expertise here at Executive around leadership, around team composition, and how people interact with each other. We do try and test for that as we're making investment decisions, because the highest reason for startup failure is a breakdown in the co-founding team or in the shareholder group. People just can't communicate, and they don't think to plan for difficult eventualities in the future. So then when you meet it, there's maybe you come at it with two totally different expectations. So we're also looking for teams that have got a vibe and they understand the expectations of one another, and they understand the journey that's ahead of them, and that they're able to have a conflict discussion and come to a productive outcome of that conversation, as opposed to just blowing up the entire company, which I've seen happen. So.
I think you also touched on something there called abstraction. So where people can actually put themselves into someone else's shoes, or where they can think about a scenario that they haven't experienced before, to be able to come up with something like mitigating factors or something like that. Do you guys test for that as well, to see if people have the cognitive ability to be able to do that zoom out on the one hand, and the other hand is to create a mental model of something before they try and apply it in the physical world?
Yeah, not so robustly as you describe it there, because what we don't want them to do is predefine a path. You can plan for eventualities, but then sometimes it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and you systemize it. So we're not looking for the execution of that ability. We're more looking for the fundamentals that would bring it together. So curiosity. When we're doing these interviews with the startups, there should be a heavy weighting of questions coming from their side. Curiosity about what our experiences of their product or their services, what our expectations in the market are, looking for that input, so that they're not coming and just sending a message to us the whole time. If we have a startup or a founder that's sending for most of the discussion, that's normally a flag to say that they're set on a certain path. And then if it deviates from that path, they're not going to be able to adapt. So so what we're really looking for is, again, coachability, curiosity, openness, because those are the fundamental elements that will allow the founders to adapt to a new set of challenges. And then ultimately, if that does become a co-founder dispute or some issue within the team and the discussion within the team members, then they'll also have a higher chance of being able to remedy that together and understand it from the other person's perspective.
Well, then one last question. If you were to give a recommendation to anybody that would like to become a co-founder or a founder, what should they look for in the people they're going to work with?
Complementary skill set, complementary personality traits. So that doesn't mean the same. That means a good enough difference to create friction for sparks, but not explosions. That's going to be important. Diversity in the team helps. It does, because otherwise you end up in this kind of very narrow brainstorm. So you should be looking for gender and cultural diversity in your co-founders. And ideally, someone with some experience who's done something before, something hard before. You want to find a co-founder who's been through the mill a little bit, because that tells you something about how they handle difficult circumstances or scenarios. I think this is me speaking from the gut. I'm not coming up with any sort of research that we've done, but that's what I would observe. I'd be looking for those traits.
I think it's a nice quote. Enough friction to cause sparks, but not an explosion. I like that. Mark, I would like to thank you for your time, and also the extra time you took when we had to go for a technical break. And it's always great talking to you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure and really interesting. I've learned a lot of things through this chat as well, Ex-Dean, so thanks for sharing those insights. Appreciate it.
Two things stood out to me. Firstly, the most common reason for failure in startups is communication breakdowns. And secondly, there can be too much nurturing. Startups need to learn the hard way, and people tend to appreciate their struggles and successes more. Some skills we can only learn through practice, failure, or trial and error. I think it's important, that spark that's at the beginning of any relationship is also there within businesses. When we work together with others, that spark is where things start. But to get to the magic, we need to hit that spot again and again and again. And that takes hard work, but it's essential. In this day and age, when we work from home a lot, building those relationships at work is hard. But for startups, it's absolutely crucial to their success. Now go out there, be exponential, and do something nice for someone else. You can find us on the web by going to podcast.exponentially.me. We will also find additional media resources and some amazing insights.